In this daily drop, I'm going to continue my exploration of using the PavoSlim 120C and now trying the difference between using a middle or 18% gray as my bounce for a key source and switching that to white. So let's go. All right, everybody, it's another episode of the Daily Drop, and this is a continuation, part 3 of a series, where I'm taking the PavoSlim 120C and I am bouncing it off of, initially, an 18% gray piece of fabric on the Easy frame from Manfrotto. That's a 6.5 by 7.5 foot frame. And in today's episode, I'm going to continue what I wanted to check next, which is what's the difference between bouncing off of gray, which is not something that I traditionally do, and going back to bouncing off of white, which is what I and most of us do when we think about bounced light for a key source. So I've got all my stuff in place here, and many of the things are identical to the way they were in the previous 2 episodes. And if you haven't seen those, I'll put links to them here in the description. The first one is really about looking at using this as a bounce key source. The second one is about solving a couple of problems, or at least one particular problem that I was having when it came to changes in light levels when my arm came into the desk area of this frame, so on and so forth. And now what we're going to do is we're going to swap out this gray fabric with white, or a 6x6 magic cloth, which is going to be virtually the same size as the original source here in gray. It's slightly smaller, but there's area down here at the bottom of this frame which really isn't returning much in terms of me. So I'm going to favor the top portion of it, and I think we'll get a very, very good idea of what's happening here. Now, for housekeeping purposes, I'm not wearing exactly the same thing I was before. That's fine. I'm not trying to compare something from part 1 and part 2. And from a camera setting standpoint, still exactly where we were before. We are at an ISO of 1600. We're at an f2.8, and nothing else has changed in terms of light levels overall. Now over here, I have scopes. I have a waveform monitor. This one's set to luma values, or light values, from 0 to 100. And I've set it up here so that we can see some values here. I'm sitting in this area here, Caucasian skin tones, at around 70. You know, if I was leaning towards what I'd want to see with my eye, I'd probably be down just slightly lower than that at around 65-ish. This is at around 70, 71. But I would rather favor slightly overexposed, as long as this doesn't feel too sourcey, and then bring that image down in post-production, as opposed to feeling underexposed and then raising that in post. Because usually what's going to happen in that situation is you're going to get the uglies down in the lower half of the image. We're going to introduce or show more noise down there. And right now, I think we're in a good place overall. You know, I'm using an A7C II. Not a bad camera, 10-bit, 422, so on and so forth, but it's not an ARRI Alexa, right? We don't have an Alexa 35 here, which not only has great dynamic range, but it also has great latitude, meaning you can push and pull that image more than you might be able to with a camera like this. So this is the basic setup. I've tried to do everything I can to really dial this in a way that when I replace this frame with the white frame, the 6x6 with magic cloth, which is a material I like to use for direct, basically diffusion or a bounce light, then I think we're going to get a pretty good idea of what this is. I've also marked the floor down there so that the frame that I'm going to put in place of the one that I have here, the Easy frame, I'm going to bring in a Scrim Jim Cine frame that's 6x6 with magic cloth. I've marked it so that we're at the same angle. And my guess is, my educated guess is that at the same output of the PavoSlim 120C, which is set to 100% right now, and is going through a little bit of magic cloth as a small break from the softbox, that I'm going to have to reduce the intensity of that particular fixture to get these levels to be similar, at least in terms of my skin tone and this area here in terms of the highlights and stuff like that. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to dip to black, and when I come back, I'll have the other frame set. I'll show you some BTS or behind the scenes of that, and we'll talk about the adjustments necessary. I'll probably start with the frame with it at 100% so we can compare what that's doing, and then we'll make an adjustment to get it to similar levels to what we have with this gray bounce. All right, I'll be right back. All right, here we are. Big difference. So right now, the only change that I have really made is I now have this Pavoslim 120C bouncing off of this 6x6 Magic Cloth. As I said before, not exactly the same width, off by about 6 inches, but the placement of the 6x6 Magic Cloth is virtually identical to the gray one from the Manfrotto Easy Frame. The height in terms of where it starts at the top is exactly the same. And in order to minimize the amount of spill, because Magic Cloth is not 100% opaque, I am actually using Ultra Bounce behind it. So Ultra Bounce usually is black on one side, white on the other. I have the white side, which is fully opaque, behind the Magic Cloth. So we're really getting an idea of what would happen if we bounced off of this without having additional spill in the room, except for what's happening naturally, but not going through the actual rag. At 100%, you can see that there's a big difference here, and I am clearly overexposed in terms of stuff. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to fix it. If you look at the waveform monitor here, as best as you can see it, we're going to have to figure out what intensity we're going to have to set this to in order to get it right. And I will tell you ahead of time, this is a little bit like a cooking show. I did a couple of tests here to make sure I knew where we needed to be, especially because when I was bouncing off of the gray fabric, that I had to make adjustments to the green magenta in order for my C800 to get a reading of no shift. I had set that to green 25. So, sorry, yeah, I had pushed that over to that side, and we're still there. So what I'm going to do is just make some adjustments here so that we can get our waveform to be about the same as it was before. So I'm just going to go ahead and use the NanLink app here, which is markedly better than the old version of the app. And let me just go ahead and set that to 50%. Still more exposure than we had before. And then we're going to set it down here to what seemed to be, for me, about the same overall exposure in terms of highlights and stuff with my skin tone, which is huge in terms of the difference, 25%. So before, 100% output through the softbox with Magic Cloth and then bouncing off of that gray. Now, 25% bouncing off at the same angle. Not that this is the angle I would use necessarily if I was using white. I might make some adjustments, but we're trying to compare here. Still the same CCT or correlated color temperature, 5900. Did some readings with the C800 and I was getting a difference of about 200 Kelvin from the way it was. So in the 5700s, not 5600s. So I would say it's about, you know, a difference of about 75-ish Kelvin bouncing off of the gray versus the white. And then the green magenta adjustment, I found that I needed to bring that down to pretty much zeroing it out from the light itself, which would make sense. You would hope that a light that's brand new shipping and is bouncing off of a neutral, relatively neutral white source wouldn't have some sort of shift. And that is the case with this. So I've got that green magenta set to 0. There are some differences, which I find to be quite interesting. And I am trying to find that same angle in terms of the bounce here, but I feel like the return, oddly enough, off of white is not as great here, and it feels a little bit darker in the frame than when I was bouncing off of the gray. Now, that might be slightly because of the larger area width-wise of the gray, but it's not much of a difference in terms of that larger area. I'm assuming that we're seeing slightly different reflections and catch in my glasses when I have them. Here it is without glasses. But basically, I'm still sticking to my instincts from before, which is I'm not recommending bouncing off of gray, but it is for talent when you're bouncing off of white like this, definitely a little more distracting, even though the IRE values that we have on the waveform monitor are virtually identical. It's just the softness and bouncing off of that gray. Now, that's a huge difference in intensity, 25% versus 100% to get a similar exposure on your talent. But I think overall, a really good test for me in terms of understanding the differences between what I'm getting. In an ideal world now, because that fabric of that gray is more fabric-y, has a little bit less in terms of sheen that Magic Cloth has, Ultra Bounce would have even more of that, I would probably back this key off a little bit more and fill more of that frame. So, so it was an even more wrapped source and have to angle it slightly differently. But in this particular test, I'm leaving the key light and the flags and the net exactly where they were before and just trying to duplicate the position and the angle of the bounce. I hope this was useful and was something that gives you some idea of the differences between what can happen when you are bouncing off of different fabrics. I'm sure this is not the last time I'm going to be doing something like this on the channel, and I feel like I need a little fill over here, especially for Mr. Baldy that's standing in this particular position. Don't forget to, and I'll see you on the next episode of The Daily Drop.